If you're looking for clear, pro-life thinking, cutting-edge apologetics, and a fresh approach to abortion dialogue, you've come to the right place. This is the Equipped for Life podcast.
All right, so we are back with Emily Albrecht. If you have not watched sort of part one of the series on outreach mistakes, probably worth going back and watching it first, because we're talking about the awesome St. Olaf Pro-Life Club, who are just, I think, masters at dialogue, amazing at outreach. But as you explained in the last episode, you weren't amazing right away. You all made mistakes. You all had to learn through a process. And so we talked a lot about the specific, like how you did outreach, how you set up your table, what your guys' body language was like kind of talking about that kind of thing. And today we're going to pivot to talking more about dialogue mistakes you made. What are the mistakes that you made once you were in your actual dialogues? Because apparently you weren't amazing at dialogue from the beginning either. So I am really looking forward to hearing more, because again, when I met you guys, you were already through this development process. I came to outreach and saw you guys are all amazing. I can't wait to hear about what it was like in the very beginning and what kinds of mistakes you guys were making, so I can compare and contrast with the kinds of mistakes that I know that I have made in my life before I got to wherever I am now in the growth process. Still a lot of growth to go, but I am very interested in hearing about how your first dialogues were. So why don't you start by telling us about the first kind of important lesson about dialogue that you guys all had to learn together by going through outreach together?
I think it's really important to make sure you know yourself. And that's something we really struggled with when we first started doing outreach. Like, you need to know who you are as a dialoguer and what your tendencies are and what directions you tend to go in, so that you're able to kind of counterbalance that and become better at the areas that you're weak in. That way you can kind of try to counterbalance that and focus on it.
Yes.
For example, I tended to be too nice and too chatty at the beginning.
That's me too.
I was not great at pushing people. I would be comfortable with kind of ending a conversation with, well, it was great to talk with you.
Right.
We can just agree to disagree.
Right.
Not
Not having gotten too deep into the actual
not having really
thing.
gotten anywhere.
Right.
Exactly.
You've just been a nice pro-lifer.
I was comfortable being just a nice pro-lifer.
Yes.
As was Joshua. That tended to be, we were on that end of the spectrum.
Yeah.
And then Meredith and Alex tended to be more pushy. They were much better at focusing on, I am making this argument. No, what you're saying doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
This is why. And they went a little too far into debate mode at the beginning.
Okay.
And I really liked the fact that we kind of had this Avengers team, like we talked about before, where we had different
You could totally
strengths.
balance each other.
And so we could balance each other out.
Yeah.
And we could start to critique each other and pull each other in the other direction. So Joshua and I needed to focus on challenging ourselves to push.
Yeah.
And be okay with making that push, be okay with spending some rapport at the end of a conversation.
Right.
And Meredith and Alex needed to focus a little more on practical dialogue tips. We had to coach them more on finding common ground and asking better questions and not jumping down someone's throat and not standing with your arms crossed, which Meredith totally did for like the first month. And I was like, Meredith, you can't stand like that. That's not going to work.
It's sending a signal. So how is it that you guys, and I imagine this is partly answered by leadership, but the fact that even your officers were all in this place of being willing to critique each other and being happy to be critiqued by the other members, especially members who had different strengths and weaknesses than them. And like, you're all balancing each other out. But like, a lot of people just would be like, aren't wanting critique. Like, this is hard enough as it is. Like, I don't want to be critiqued on this. Like, I'm out here. I can check this box, and are like, they get their feelings hurt if they're being critiqued after a really difficult dialogue where there's like, they're doing so many different things well. Yes, maybe 10% they could get better, but it's like, man, I just like, there was pretty fine. Like, how did you create an environment where everyone was good with that?
I think it partially has to do with the mindset switch that we had for the purpose of dialogue. And really all of us being on the same page about, this isn't about us being the heroes. This isn't about us changing the world.
Mm-hmm.
This is about us getting better and doing better and creating better dialogues.
Yeah.
And so that mindset switch, it also helped the fact that 3 out of the 4 of us were music majors. And if you're a musician, that's an environment you live
You're
in
used to
all the
critique.
time. You are used to
Yeah.
playing something or singing something or whatever, and your teacher saying, great, that wasn't good enough.
Right.
And like, it is never good enough because in the music world, there is always something that can be better.
Yes.
And so if that's not an environment that you're used to, I can see why other club members critiquing you and whatever would be intimidating. Yeah. But that was just like rolling off a log for Meredith and Joshua and I, because we're just used to nothing ever being good enough. And you always having to push.
Blowing my mind. This is blowing my mind because I wonder if this has also been part of the reason I am the way that I am, because I'm a musician too. And I haven't thought about this at all. Because when you're a musician, you're also constantly in self-critical mode. Like you're always critiquing yourself, like not when you're first starting, but like by the time you're in college for music, like you're used to constantly critiquing yourself. You can't stop critiquing others also. You can't turn that part of your mind off. Like it's just there.
And you're always practicing to make yourself better.
Yeah.
That's just a part of your daily schedule.
I'm not as good as that. But yeah, if you're like a really good musician and take it seriously, then you're practicing. That's so interesting.
And you're also taught as a musician to observe other people in order to affect your own performance.
Yes.
Like if you're learning a piece of music, you go onto YouTube and you watch a bunch of different people do it. And everybody does it in different ways. Like there's 3,000 people that have played every single piano piece or every soprano aria out there.
Yeah.
And so you're listening to how they do it and taking bits and pieces and not taking other bits and pieces. And so, I mean, that's essentially how we did those first outreaches. We would observe each other and observe each other practice dialoguing and start to take bits and pieces from each other. And we would like deliberately pair people together at the table who were opposites. Like we would pair Meredith and I or Meredith and Joshua at the table together.
Yeah.
So they could hear each other talking and then they would debrief together afterwards.
You guys are so good.
So Meredith would push Joshua on the conversations she had heard him do, being like, you needed to do this.
Yeah.
And Joshua would push Meredith, being like, you weren't as nice as you could have been here, whatever. And because we were already kind of in that mode of you should watch and learn from other people and critique each other and always improve yourself, then it just felt really natural to have those kinds of debriefs and observations of each other.
Okay, so if I'm understanding right, Alex wasn't a musician, though.
Correct. He was the one out.
But he was fine with being critiqued.
Yes,
so
he was fine
what
with
is he going to do for the non-musicians? Because you want everyone to be in this place where they're willing to critique and they're willing to be critiqued and they're being open-minded and humble and they're not taking themselves super seriously. How did you get the non-musicians to be that way?
I think it comes from modeling it, honestly.
Yeah.
When we first teach material, let's say in a club meeting, we're going over some new argument or whatever, we will very frequently do some sort of public practice dialogue before we ask people to practice dialogue it themselves. Yeah. So Meredith and I might get up and I'm pro-life and Meredith is pro-choice and we will go over like a micro dialogue or we just go over that little section.
Trot at a toddler or
exactly.
something.
And then we will have the club publicly critique me.
Even though you guys are the leaders.
Even though we're the leaders, and I am supposedly, the best pro-lifer in the room at doing this, hypothetically. Right. Their job is to critique me. And it's also really helpful when like everyone knows I'm not the best pro-lifer in the room because Joshua is sitting right there and Joshua's just as good as I am. And so Joshua will maybe start out the critique. Yeah. And so the other students feel comfortable like, oh yeah, I can critique
They're
something.
also watching how you react to Joshua.
Yes. They're watching how I react. And sometimes I'll even like go back and try part of it again. Be like, oh, that was like, okay, let me try rephrasing how I said that. And I'll like slip back in and do it. And so we have created this environment where they feel like I am open to critique. They're comfortable critiquing me. Yeah. And so they start to just kind of by effect be okay with it themselves. They're going to mirror that. And you also have to be, and this is just true of like teaching in general, you have to be aware of how you're phrasing your critique and how you start off
Talk a little
your
bit
critique.
about that because you have teaching classes and stuff that you've gone through. So what have you learned through that about how to phrase critique?
I always start with positive, which I think most people know that you should do. Yeah. But I'll be really specific about what's positive. Don't just be like, yeah, that was really good.
That's
okay,
good.
now we need to work on this.
Right.
Like,
here's all the specific things that you
they don't
screwed up.
believe that it was actually good.
Yes.
If you're going to say that was good, you need to back it up. Or I won't even say that was good. I'll just go through, Amanda, I really loved how you brought in this use of humor with specifically Stumpy the squirrel. Stumpy the squirrel is this squirrel around the state Olaf campus that is infamous because he has no tail. And so she was going through the equal rights argument, and she actually used Stumpy the squirrel. And it was like a really funny comedic moment. And she like talked about it was great. It was gold. This actually happened in a meeting like 2 weeks ago. And so like I brought that up in my public critique of her. I was like, you brought in Stumpy the squirrel, and that was genius. Like I was laughing. You totally got this other person, the pro-choice person you were talking to, the fake pro-choice person you were talking to laugh and bring their walls down. Like I am being incredibly specific with what she did well. And I'll always list maybe like 3 or 4 things that are you did this great. You worded this part really well. I loved how you used this phrase. I loved how concise you were with this. You did a really great job of being clear with what you were trying to say. And I felt like I understood you, blah, blah, blah. Like I will give a very specific list.
The fact that you're doing more than one also helps show this isn't just a token. Like you've got to come up with something positive before you get to the important stuff. Like you're like, it's like, wow, that's a whole lot of things that she really did like.
Exactly.
And then you get to your critique.
Right. And so then my critique, I am saying, here's the things that I think we could work on for your next conversation. Not here are the things you did wrong.
Yeah.
This is what we could work on.
We could work on.
Yes, exactly.
That's great.
And so I'll go through, usually I pick maybe 2 things. Like if this conversation was just a crisis and they're like, they're a very new person, this is their very first practice dialogue and like they messed up the equal rights argument. They didn't ask a single clarification question. They didn't do there's just a whole bunch of things. And I'm sitting there going, okay, where do I start?
Right.
I'll just pick 1 or 2 things because most people can't focus on more than 1 or 2 things at once. And that goes directly back to my music background.
Yeah.
There's this thing I learned from my high school piano teacher called a 1-goal practice that I try to use in my own practice. And I try to use when I'm teaching choir, when I'm teaching solo voice and solo piano, which I do on the side, which is focus on one thing at a time. And if you can, strip away the other things. Like the things that they teach us to do when we're, say, teaching a new piece of choral repertoire is you take away the words. Sometimes you take away the notes and you just kind of learn the rhythm first. And then you add on the notes and then you add on this other thing. And then if you try the whole thing together and everything's breaking down, back it up again. Or just give them one thing to fix. Be like, we're going to sing this through and I want you to focus on the dynamics. I don't care if you sing all the notes wrong. Like, that's fine. I'm not going to say... And then follow through on that. When you get to the end of the phrase, if they sang the notes wrong, don't mention it because you just said that you wouldn't. You promised we're going to focus on this one thing. And so I do the exact same thing when I'm critiquing dialogues is I'll say, okay, I'm going to pick 1 or 2 things. And usually I'll always pick the relational, very practical dialogue tips type things first. If they mess up the equal rights argument in the practice dialogue, but they, did all of the practical dialogue tip things perfectly, then we'll go talk about how to do the equal rights argument better. But first, I want to tackle the persona that they're giving off. And so I'll pick 1 or 2 things for them to focus on. And then if I have time, have them try it again. And focus on those things. And if they get those things, then I'm going to compliment those things. And then we're probably going to be done for the day. Assuming I'm not having a 2-hour-long practice dialogue session and I'm just kind of bouncing around between groups in my club meeting, if they, got done and fixed the 2 things I asked them to, woohoo, gold star, we're going to move on, put this to bed until next week.
So there's a recognition that everyone has a limit to probably how much of the critique they can take in one day, too.
Exactly.
That's so wise.
Exactly. And so you want them to walk away from the meeting feeling successful. Feeling like they improved what they were doing, they got better, they got positive feedback from you, they're not horrible at dialogue, maybe they've still got things to work on, but they feel like their meeting was a success because they did pretty well in the first one, they got some negative feedback, but they got to try it again, and they fixed the things you gave them. That's a rewarding experience. Yeah,
that's really good. All right, tell me about another dialogue mistake that you guys made.
A lot at the beginning, we struggled to figure out how to make our conversations really organic. Specifically, we felt like we were kind of using a formula that we had learned from the Equip for Life course. And we tried to manipulate everything someone would say into something we knew how to respond to. So like someone would say something and then my inner brain monologue would go, okay, how do I manipulate this into a trot at a toddler? Because I know how to do that.
Right.
And like
you're trying to get into your comfort zone,
right,
or
exactly.
within the realms of the things that you've heard us talk about already.
Exactly, which is obviously a really comfortable thing to do.
Yes.
And it helps like you feel like you know what you're doing a little bit more, which is good. Like I want you to feel like you know what you're doing. And the Equip for Life course does have a lot of tools that you should be using.
Right.
The problem is when you try to plug a person into a formula, you stop listening to what they're actually saying. And that's what I found myself doing is I was spending too much time worrying about, is what they're saying something I've learned? And if not, how do I make it into something I've learned?
Right.
Instead of actually trying to understand them.
Yeah.
Because it's actually way easier to respond to what they're saying after you've listened to what they said.
Yes.
Shocker.
This is true. Without straw manning them.
Yes, exactly. But I think we needed to work a lot on just making our conversations more organic. And that really was helped by our practice dialogues that we did. Just getting a chance to work through talking, not just talking about the arguments in like a group setting, perhaps, or like listening to the course, but like you need a chance to practice things.
Yeah.
And whether that's with your college group or that's with a friend or that's with a parent or a sibling or whatever, like whoever you're going through the course with, like find a friend and make sure that you're having time to actually talk through the arguments and learn how to make them flow into a conversation instead of just a point and plug and formula mind map of like, I will go here and I will go here, regardless of what the pro-choice person actually says.
Right. So did you guys discover that you were doing this, like you're doing practice dialogues and at some point the pro-choice person says like, I kind of feel like you're forcing me like into a certain box, or do you guys just kind of realize at outreach you're doing this thing and in the practice dialogues you were not doing that thing for some reason? Like how did you diagnose that this was a thing that was happening?
I think we noticed it both in our practice dialogues and in our actual dialogues at outreach. Like we would definitely have real life pro-choice people say something along the lines of, I feel like you're not listening to what I'm saying, or
that's
I feel
definitely
like,
a red flag.
I feel like you're like putting me in a box here, or like trying to guide the conversation in a direction that's different than what I'm actually saying. And so we would have
pro-life people do that a lot.
Yeah.
I think that's like a lot more common than not doing that. And I think it's a reasonable, like it's an understandable mistake for people to make, but I do really want people to avoid making that mistake.
Exactly. And I think it just comes with practice. You just need a chance to feel like you can speak through the arguments without sounding like you're reciting something, or you're trying to force the conversation to go somewhere.
Yeah.
And that can just be hard.
Yeah. So like in my head, I'm imagining like, okay, so if you plotted out like all the parts of the conversation on like a timeline, and there's going to be these parts of the conversation, like this is like an hour-long conversation. Like there's going to be parts of it that the equipped pro-life person is going to be ready for, okay? So it's like if you imagine those sections of the dialogue as being like green, you know, like, yeah, we're all good. There's still going to be segments in between those where it's like you don't exactly know where this is going, or you don't feel like you're on like really solid ground. You're trying to figure out what they mean by something, or you're trying to figure out even what their argument is. And that's, I think, the part that pro-life people feel really uncomfortable in. And I think what I would want people to know is it's okay. Your goal shouldn't be to make those non-green segments as short as humanly possible so that as much of the time you're kind of like in control. I think it's like, try to get comfortable with not knowing where this is going, or whether or not you're about to trot at a toddler or not. Like, become comfortable with not running the conversation and, you know, learning about them and let it just kind of organically it's going to take more time. And then at some point, it's going to get to one of the things you've thought about before, like what about back alley abortions or whatever? Like it's going to happen, but be okay with like the discomfort or whatever. Just kind of like, okay, I don't know exactly where this is going, but it's okay. I'm going to take my time. I'm going to trust it's going to be fine.
I think you also have to be okay with not having all the answers and admitting that you don't.
Yes.
Because the pro-choice person is going to take your arguments way more seriously if you're willing to sometimes say, if they bring up a new point or they phrase something differently, if you're like, I need a minute to digest that. I haven't heard that before. Like, they realize that you're not just reading off a script, which sometimes it could feel like for us at the very beginning. And so when we were willing to admit that we didn't necessarily have all the answers and we needed some processing time on a new point, or we were, just thinking something through out loud with the person, they felt like it was more organic. And I think they just took us more seriously as like real people that think about this issue, not someone that just memorized a monologue.
Right. They're not just talking to a pro-life bot or something like that. This is like, trained to spit out different answers upon different cues. Yeah.
Exactly. But speaking of like spewing out answers, another problem that we had at the beginning is
good
that
segue.
we were, I know it was a really good segue. We were not really willing to stand on facts.
What do you mean?
There are certain things like the biology of the unborn and the fact that abortion is killing. Perhaps it's justified killing. Someone could argue that, but it is physically killing of an organism of some sort. Like, those are two facts that I personally, and I know Joshua and I know Meredith, we all struggled with being willing to actually stand on those facts and say, these are facts.
Right.
This is not wishy-washy. This is not my opinion. We can have a great debate philosophically about whether this is a person that should have rights or whether or not this killing should be justified. But you can't really argue about the biology of what's happening, or you can't really argue about what literally an abortion procedure is and does. I think oftentimes pro-lifers fall into one of two traps, specifically kind of with the biology of the unborn, but also it can be in the abortionist killing realm too. I think pro-lifers either often answer with biology when that's not what was asked for. And we talk about that a lot. Where someone says that, the unborn isn't a person, it's not a thing that should have rights. And immediately pro-lifers are like, oh, you mean you don't understand biology? And they go off on that
Don't
train.
You know it's a human? It's a member of our species. Yeah.
And that
which is understandable.
Not,
I don't want to be making fun of those people because I sometimes go like too quick. It can, at least I can come across as making fun of the pro-life people doing that. Like, everyone's done that. It's just important to understand that the science part of this question and the philosophy part of this question are two different things. And a lot of times pro-choice people are talking about the philosophy side.
Right. And so I think that pro-lifers will often fall into that trap.
Yes.
I tended to fall in the other extreme of that trap, which I think is a result partially of having focused so much on not wanting to fall into the first extreme, is that I was scared to stand on any biology facts ever.
Interesting.
So if someone legitimately brought up biology, they were like, no, I actually mean, like, I asked the clarification question and they're like, no, I actually mean that it is not biologically a person. Like, it's not biologically a member of our species. And I have talked to those people.
It's not human.
I was not willing. I'd be like, well, I think that, like, I was not willing to actually
What would you say? What would you do?
I would like, we didn't have the brochure at that point, the standard ERA outreach brochure. So I'd just be like, well, the way I understand it, the fetus is biologically a member of our species. People will debate that, but I think it's pretty obvious. Like, I just phrased it as like I think there is some debate about it. What do you think about that? Like, I phrased it like it was a philosophical question, and I treated it like one.
Like a matter of opinion.
Exactly. Instead of being willing to say, no, it is biologically a member of the species. And then what I do now, I say that and I give them some sort of an out. I'll say, that doesn't mean you have to change your pro-choice view because of that right now. Like,
I think that's really important.
There's a lot of people that believe correctly that the fetus is biologically a member of the species, but think that it's not the kind of thing that should have rights. Or maybe that it should have rights, but that killing it is justified because of something else, because it's in her body or something like that. And I'll kind of very vaguely explain good pro-choice arguments to them and let them pick one of those and go off there.
Okay, so let's talk about that for a minute. So it's so ironic that we're doing this and you have no idea, but I recently had a conversation with a donor who has a general concern about the kind of thing that you're talking about here. And so I want you to be able to talk to those people who are like, why would you give them these outs? Like, why would you hand them a better pro-choice argument that they can then move to instead of like going in for the kill, like that kind of thing. Like you've totally got them on the science thing. They said the anti-science thing. You can come in and be like, nope, that's not right. But you're doing a thing where you're saying like, you can still be pro-choice and agree with me about the scientific facts here by saying X, Y, or Z. And some pro-life people here will be like, why would you help them stay pro-choice? Aren't you trying to make them pro-life? Like, why are you doing that?
I think it would be really naive for me to think that if I just change their mind about the biology thing, they're going to become pro-life and stay pro-life forever.
See, I don't think that's obvious to most pro-life people. I think a lot of pro-life people, and again, not making fun, like, are just like, to them, it's like, they must just be confused about the humanity of the unborn. And as soon as they unlock that, like, that's the silver bullet. This is a human, therefore, this is a human rights issue, and all humans should be equal. So, like, we're good to go. Like, that should be all that pro-choice people need to change their mind.
The problem is that's not the kind of argument that the smartest pro-choice people out there are making.
Right.
The smartest pro-choice people understand that the unborn is biologically a member of the species, but they've found other ways to justify abortion. Now, I think those other ways still have very, very big problems with them. But if I talk to a pro-choice person and I manage to convince them on the biology, they might be pro-life for a day or a year or 10 years, but eventually they're probably going to run into one of those more powerful pro-choice arguments.
Yep.
And I don't want them to just go back and switch their mind and become pro-choice again.
Right.
And so I would rather dismantle all the pro-choice arguments at once if I can. And so I think it's actually better if they have a bad pro-choice argument to hand them a better one and then talk about why that one also doesn't make sense so that they don't come across it in the wild, quote unquote, because I don't want to just change their mind for a day.
Right.
I want to actually change their mind about the issue.
There's a few other things I think you're doing there too. Is one, you're showing that you're intellectually honest. Like you are willing to, like the fact that you're willing to say there are better pro-choice arguments means that you are comfortable with the idea of them not changing their mind today. Which that's not the way people debate politics. This is not how people do it. And it also shows that you understand this issue really well, that you can make a better pro-choice argument than they can, which I think then makes you kind of intriguing because it's like, well, if you understand the pro-choice view better than I do and you're still not pro-choice, maybe there's a good reason for that. And I think most importantly, given that most people are not capable of changing their mind in one day about such a serious topic, like you kind of knowing that and saying like, look, you can agree with the scientific facts here and stay pro-choice makes it a lot easier for them to kind of drop their defenses and accept that maybe they were wrong about the scientific facts here. And like you've incrementally gotten them to accept some change of the view while kind of maintaining the parts that they care the most about that you can still try to get at later. And it might be in 3 conversations, but you're realizing they're not going to change their mind probably in one day, and that's okay. In online marketing, sometimes people talk about like you try to get a micro yes out of people. Like it's a lot easier for like a nonprofit to get someone to like your Facebook post than it is to get them to give you a donation. And so you want to like try to get people like get used to like doing really, really small things. And so maybe down the road, they'll be more likely to do bigger things like volunteer or donate or whatever. I feel like this is like the persuasion version of that. Like you're getting micro yeses out of them so that down the road, it'll be either they are becoming trained a little bit psychologically to not be in constant fight mode with you.
And I think they also feel like I'm not trying to trick them.
Yes.
Because if they find out later about a better pro-choice argument, they might look back on this conversation and feel like I tricked them.
Right.
And even just in the moment, I am giving them an out. I'm saying, I'm not trying to lead you somewhere and force you by not telling you this extra information to change your mind. Like, I want you to have all the facts. we are here trying to find truth together
We're in
and follow the
truth-seeking
truth where
mode.
it leads.
Yeah.
And so I think it just makes them respect me more, first of all, and be more open to hearing what I have to say, because they now really know I'm not trying to trick them because I just handed them this extra information.
That's awesome.
Okay, so I think one more thing we haven't really talked about yet is the idea of clarity, which is something that my club really, really struggled with at the beginning, especially me and Joshua. We get the awards for being the worst at being clear with what we're saying. And I would just specifically often get tripped up when I was trying to explain complicated philosophical things like equal rights argument or bodily autonomy. Because there's a lot of different pieces, and I would kind of try to like memorize a thought experiment in the Equip for Life course, and then like have to remember how you said it and what order to say it in and how many animals were there or how many animals am I supposed to ask about in the Equal Right to Life circle, and I don't know. And then it would just get very confusing.
I love that I'm just picturing our listeners right now that are like, it wasn't just me that had that problem. Like, yay.
Yes, clarity can be super hard.
Yeah.
Like, especially when you have so many thoughts in your head.
Yeah.
Because oftentimes when a pro-choice person says something, it could mean one of like 10 different things. Like they'll often come up and they'll say some sort of slogan. And then in my head, I'm like, well, I should respond with this, and this. But, I was supposed to ask this clarification question before I did that to make sure I understand what they're actually saying. And like my brain started doing 500 things immediately. And so the first thing that you have to do is kind of learn to turn off that inner monologue and hear them, which is problem number one.
Right.
That way you can actually respond to what they're saying, which will help you be more clear. Because you don't feel like you're responding to every possible version of this argument. You're just responding to what they said.
Yeah.
And second of all, I think that it's really helpful to use the phrase that you talk about in the Equip for Life course, this is what I mean and this is what I don't mean.
Yep.
And we practice that a lot in our practice dialogues because especially when we're using trot at a toddler specifically, it can be really hard to say it in a way that doesn't come across poorly.
Like they're an idiot.
Like
or something
they're
like
an idiot.
Yeah.
Or that you hate women, you think women are
Right.
bad and would do some of the bad things that we like use as examples in a trot at a toddler, like killing their toddler, right? Like, so there's multiple ways you could go wrong in being clear about this is a thought experiment. This is the purpose of my thought experiment.
Yeah.
This is what my thought experiment is supposed to show. I don't think you're stupid.
Right.
Like all those things
I
need
don't
to happen.
think that women who have abortions are like women who kill toddlers. There's
Right.
really different and important ways. Here's what I'm trying to say. Yeah.
Exactly. So we found that using a lot of this is what I mean, this is what I don't mean was really helpful along with just doing practice. I think I've said that like 500 times on this podcast.
Yeah. You
The
get it yet?
importance of
Practice.
practicing and having other people listen to you for clarity.
Yeah.
That's something we focus on a lot, specifically with Joshua and I, critiquing each other. How can you be more clear with this? How can you say this in less words?
Yeah.
How can you get to the point and then ask them what they think and not go around 600 rabbit holes before you ask them what they think?
Yeah, I know I've talked about this before, but it's just worth I'll try to do like a short review. But trot at a toddler, especially, is the kind of thing where I think pro-choice people can easily be confused about what the pro-life person is saying. So, like a few of the like kind of additions to the toddler training that we've done that we've kind of added since we started have been so like, for example, I try to avoid having pro-life people ask the person if they think it would be okay to kill the toddler in this circumstance in like an inquisitive way. Like, do you think it would be okay to kill a toddler to solve poverty? Like,
do you think I'm stupid?
Right.
Like,
or
what?
like this horrible person.
Right.
Like, of course they don't think you can kill the toddler in this. So instead, do it in kind of a, okay, I'm sure we agree we can't kill toddlers for that reason, right? Like, okay, cool. Like, because otherwise it just comes across as like, I wonder, how horrible are you? Like, like, are you like, would you be willing to concede that we shouldn't kill a toddler in that particular situation? Like, it can just come across bad.
Right.
I think the more subtle way that it can come across wrong, and Tim has told the story before about having a really important conversation with one of our cousins who's both an intellectual and pro-choice. I'm pretty sure he would label himself as pro-choice. And he had this really interesting reaction to hearing Trot at the Toddler done, where I think this happens subconsciously for pro-choice people a lot. I think in particular, my cousin was smart enough and quick enough on his feet to be able to figure out why he was bothered and explain it well. And it was so helpful for Tim and then the rest of us to hear. It sounds like we're saying that women who have abortions, post-abortive women, are just like women who would like drown their toddler in a bathtub out of like anger or something like that. Like, that's not what we mean, because you should think the moral culpability is more complicated than that. It's not purely, you know, every time someone is killed, the exact same kind of wrong thing has been done, or there's an equal amount of culpability on the person. Like, culpability is really complicated. We talk about this in the self-defense, the refuting the self-defense abortion thing too, where it's like you could have someone go crazy and kill their toddler, okay? They are less culpable. Still, a toddler was killed. Still an equally valuable human being. A toddler was killed. But how culpable is the person if they're crazy, if they've been coerced into it, if there's an accomplice? Is it like a premeditated thing or not? Like, all these things are things that like judges and juries consider when they're trying to figure out how culpable someone is. And I don't think that a lot of women having abortions are nearly as culpable for killing their child as like if a woman in her, you know, like fully cognizant, you know, place just got really upset and like drowned her toddler or something like that. Like, I think a lot of women having abortions don't really know this is a baby. I know a lot of pro-life people don't buy that. I've heard so many pro-life people like, every woman knows this is a baby. Yeah, maybe at some point, but I don't think a lot of in the like early first trimester, especially if they've grown up being told by everyone in their life, including maybe their church, that this is not really a baby. And I don't think they're trying to kill anything. I think they're trying to become like unpregnant. They're trying to get out of a crisis. Does it make it okay? No. Should it be legal? No. But it's still different than the mother who literally drowns her toddler in a bathtub. And I feel like pro-life people need to kind of explain that. You need to kind of say, I'm not saying this is what post-abortive women are like. Just like we do in the, you know, the fishing at the lake thing, you know, when people are like, how can you as a man talk about this? Like, we've got this whole story about a woman pushing her car into the lake. Always say, this is not what I'm saying all pro-choice people are like, or women who have abortions. That's not the point. The point is this other thing. And so, yeah, I think pro-life people need to be more aware of the ways that they can be misunderstood. It's not necessarily the pro-life person's doing a bad job communicating. Maybe they could do a better job communicating it, but also this is like really easy way for well-intentioned people to misunderstand each other, and using techniques like here's what I'm not saying, here's what I'm saying are really helpful ways to kind of like get rid of the potential straw man, like the future straw men, like before they happen. Let's just like deal with that before that even becomes a thing, and we can keep focusing on the important parts of the conversation.
Right. I think it's so important for us to try to take as much of the burden for the clarity as possible.
Yes.
Because it can be so easy to misinterpret something like a trot at a toddler, especially if you're coming into the conversation as a pro-choice person in a headspace where you're already not super inclined to necessarily believe what this pro-life person is saying. Like, you haven't built enough rapport with them yet.
Right.
You've had some maybe bad experiences with pro-lifers in the past, or with what you think pro-lifers are and what they stand for. And so we need to take as much of the burden of clarity as possible.
Right.
And that will eventually help them to also start seeing the benefit of the, taking the benefit of the doubt in what we have to say, and start not needing perhaps as much clarity, because they're like, oh yeah, I know you don't actually mean that, kind of a thing. But we at the beginning need to take as much responsibility for that as possible. And that just comes with practice, learning how to say arguments in a way that's concise but clear and clarifies what you mean and what you don't.
Right. And if you as a pro-lifer are hearing Emily say that and are like, well, that's not fair. It should be 50-50. We should both share the responsibility of clarity. That would be more just. I would say, yes, that would be more just and fair. But also, this isn't probably a fair fight to begin with. I don't think of it as a fair fight when I'm hanging out at St. Olaf or anywhere else having conversations with pro-choice people, because it's very unlikely that they've thought more about this than I have. And it's not their fault. Like, I'm older and I've been doing this professionally.
Do it for a job.
Since I was like 21 or whatever. Like, it's not a fair fight. And so that's part of the reason I think it's totally fine to be like, I'm gonna make clarity completely my responsibility and do everything I can to help me be understood by them and make sure that I am understanding them accurately. And I'm doing a lot of extra work to make sure that happens. And I don't care whether it's fair, in the end, if it makes the dialogue better, great. That means they're more likely to change their mind too. So like at a principled and a pragmatic level, like it's okay. Pro-lifers, make clarity your responsibility.
Okay, so before we end this podcast, we should talk about how to end a conversation because I was really, really bad at that when I first started doing outreach. Almost as bad as that as I am at making a good segue to the end of this podcast.
That was the cheesiest segue I think we've ever had on the podcast, but I like it. Let's keep it.
Fabulous. Thank you. I hope you all enjoyed.
What did you learn about ending conversation?
Starting out, was way too nice at the end of my conversation, which
this
sounds
is a
like
common
a
mistake
weird,
for me too.
yeah, and it's a weird problem to have, and I think it's a good problem to have. Like,
yes.
I would rather be way too nice ending a conversation than way too mean.
Yeah.
Because I think that when you're an incredibly kind and virtuous person in the conversation, that does more to change the pro-choice person's perspective on who pro-lifers are than anything else.
Yeah.
And so if I'm working with a new person who's just starting dialogue, I always want to have them err on the side of being too nice at the end. And then maybe we can start to push a little bit.
Yeah.
But it's not always as helpful to start from the other direction and be too aggressive and then have to tone it back. But I definitely fell on the category of being too nice and not knowing how to challenge people at the end of the conversation. Like, I would end way too many conversations with like, okay, well, we can just kind of agree to disagree. Hope you have a great day. It was nice talking to you.
Right.
Like,
thanks for sharing your opinions.
Thanks for sharing your opinions. Done.
Yeah.
Not like this is actually a serious thing. You need to think about what I had to say, etc. And so it took a lot of time for my club members and I to kind of learn about the concept of rapport and how to spend it effectively and how to make that judgment call. Right. So I've heard Eri talk about rapport a lot. The idea of throughout a conversation, it's kind of like you are getting tickets to spend in an arcade, depending on like how you're using your body language and the humor and how their walls have come down. But they're only arcade tickets and you don't get to spend them someplace else.
Yes.
Like, you can only spend them in this conversation.
Yeah.
And so you need to spend them at the end in some sort of final push in which you often you might invite them to think about this further, maybe invite them to further dialogue if you can, and end with kind of recapping the conversation. This is where we are. You need to think about this more clearly and say something that makes them uncomfortable with their worldview and leaves them there.
Yes.
So that they have to keep thinking.
Yeah. Don't rescue them from feeling uncomfortable with their inconsistent worldview.
Right. Which is something that I would do all the time. I would rescue them and be like, you don't need to feel uncomfortable. This is a great conversation.
Right.
But that was also made more complicated for me because the outreaches I was doing, the dialogues I was doing, were on a college campus where I'm going to see a lot of these students again.
Yes.
And that's a really different environment than if you're just dialoguing with someone you're never going to see again. And I think for a lot of listeners who might be talking to their family or their friends or in their church about this issue, they're going to be in a similar position to what I was, where these are all people you're talking to who you're going to see again. Yep. And so in those kind of cases, I don't think you can spend all of your rapport. Yes. And it becomes a judgment call in the conversation, which is so hard. Like, I'm sitting here saying, okay, how much rapport can I spend? How much can I push without spending it all? So that I still have some left where they feel like we're still friends. Yeah. We could talk again. We could talk about other things. We could talk about this, etc. And so that took a lot of time and a lot of messing it up.
So I want to hear some examples of how to do that badly and then how it sounds when you do it well.
I think for me, when I tend to do it badly, I always fall on the side of being too nice. So I can remember one specific conversation that I was in where they had basically ended by agreeing that it should be okay to kill 2-year-olds. Like, they had had bitten the bullet and they had agreed that it should be okay to kill 2-year-olds. Yep. And
Link in the description for a podcast of me and Rachel talking about how to deal with that kind of a person.
And I basically ended it, like, this was pretty early on. I basically ended it being like, that's really sad. I mean, like, that's really sad. I wasn't like, that's okay.
Okay.
But I was like, that's really sad that you think that. I guess we'll just kind of have to agree to disagree here. Hope you have a great day.
Yeah.
Was just kind of how I left it, which wasn't awful.
No, okay. I thought you were going to be like, well, that was great. Okay, well, I guess, we're cool,
I don't think it was that bad. I really don't think it was that bad.
I believe you.
But I've talked to, like, that equivalent person today.
Yeah.
And now I know how to end that conversation a little better, where I'll say something along the lines of, I'm really grateful that you stopped and talked with me today. I thought we had a really, great discussion. I'm sorry you have to go to class, but I'd love to continue this with you later.
Mm-hmm.
I am a little concerned, though, that, when we got to the end of this conversation, it sounded like you were saying that it would be okay to kill 2-year-olds. And I really hope that you think about that, because if that's what you have to agree to in order to maintain your pro-choice view, like, that makes me extremely worried. As someone that's majoring in education and is really concerned about youth and the future of our society, I think it's really, really concerning that we're not treating all born humans even like they should have the same rights. Yeah. So, thanks for stopping, but I really hope that you think about that seriously, because that's a really, really serious claim you made.
Yeah. That's a lot more pushy, for lack of a better word, than the, well, that was great, thanks for stopping by, like that kind of thing.
Right.
Like, you are pushing them. It's like semi-gentle of a push. Like, you're not, like, trying to drop the mic on them. Like, you're,
right. I'm not saying, excuse me, you said what? Well, I don't think I can have a conversation with you anymore because you think it should be okay to kill toddlers. Like,
why should I feel safe around you? Like, apparently you don't take human rights seriously. Like, I've seen pro-life people do this professionally. Like, it's not the move.
Right. But the move is, you said something that really seriously concerns me. Right. I hope you take that seriously. Let me reiterate for you how serious this is that you just said.
Right. And it seems like this is the difference between us.
This is the difference between us.
Yeah.
Exactly.
I think that's really good. It's interesting that you found that you never made the mistake of pushing too hard. Like, you're so nice. Like, anytime you made the mistake, you were probably erring on the side of being too nice. I think Steve Wagner basically had to tell me the same thing. Like, one time, it was like I think he was trying to help me to be a little bit more assertive in the conversations. And the picture I got in my mind because I didn't want to overcompensate and end up on the other side. Mm-hmm. And so the way that I thought about it was like flight simulation games. I don't know if you ever played a flight simulation game.
I have.
Okay. So, like when you're landing, you're getting set up to land, and like you were mostly lined up with the runway, and now you just need to like just dial it in. Uh-huh. If you like do like this noob thing and like hardcore, like, push the joystick way to the right, you're going to be like so off, you've got to turn around and like start again kind of a thing. Like, you can like way overcorrect. And so it's like this tiny little adjustments, just a little bit more until like you get centered. And so like I started thinking, like, my conversations started to be like, I think this was the wording Steve used, like, try 1 degree pushier than makes you comfortable, because what you're comfortable with is not on the bullseye. You're a little bit off the bullseye. And so going 1 or 2 steps further than makes you comfortable is probably like dead on accurate. And so that's kind of the way that I started trying to like be cognizant in my conversations, so that I don't think I ever overcorrected. I think I've rarely been too like, rude or something like that to someone. But it was important feedback, because I, like you and like Joshua, I've got so much in my head, the kinds of pro-life people I'm trying not to emulate, and the kinds of pro-life people that maybe this person's already had experiences with. And so like, just like kind of overcorrecting for the sake of that, even if maybe they haven't had those experiences. And so it sounds like we've kind of had to learn the same thing.
Yeah, I think that's really wise to start by overcorrecting on the side of being too nice. And that's what I try to teach all of my new club members, regardless of where they're at coming in on the nice to pushy scale. Right. I try to kind of shove them all onto the nice side first.
And then you can slightly pull them back.
Yeah. Because I think that more than likely the pro-choice person you're talking to has had some sort of negative experience with a pro-lifer, whether it's a personal one or just them
Social
watching the
media or
news on
whatever.
social media.
Yeah.
Like they have seen some obnoxious pro-lifer.
Yeah.
And it is more beneficial to them to have a too nice pro-lifer that can hopefully affect their intuition about pro-lifers, which will help them eventually change their mind, than to have another pushy pro-lifer that just reinforces their idea that all pro-lifers are mean and not worth listening to.
Yeah.
And so it's better to start with being too nice and then pull it into the middle.
Yeah. So you have been very transparent in the last couple of episodes about mistakes that you and your club made, both on outreaches and in dialogues. I'm very interested in, I would love to see comments from people on what are the mistakes that you have found yourself making? Like, have you made different mistakes than the mistakes that we've talked about in these last couple of episodes? I would love to see in the comments people talking about like what their journey has been like, kind of starting out talking about abortion or maybe even something else. What are, like, looking back, what are things that you have learned not to do that maybe you used to do? I would love to see that in the comments. And then the next episode, unless something happens with the publishing schedule, I know the next episode we're going to record, and probably the next one that we'll publish, will be kind of pivoting more to how do you deal with a really hostile campus admin? Because for people who've heard your story know, your campus hasn't been the easiest one to work with always. It's a lot better now, but it wasn't always really easy to work with. And we've kind of told, like, you know, here's like some ways that the campus has changed, but we haven't talked a lot about how, and kind of getting into the weeds of what are the things that you guys did that helped turn the campus admin from one that was pretty hostile to your pro-life group to one that is like the best that maybe I've heard of as far as any of the clubs that we've worked with. And so tune in next time for that conversation.
Thank you for listening to the Equipped for Life podcast, a project of Equal Rights Institute. Equal Rights Institute uses speaking, writing, YouTube videos, podcasts, online courses, and campus outreach to help pro-life advocates in the areas of practical dialogue tips, relational apologetics, pro-life philosophy, and sidewalk counseling. If you've been helped by this podcast, please consider supporting it by making a donation at equalrightsinstitute.com.